In 2020, the world was shut down. People isolated themselves in their homes, not knowing when they'll be let out again. But society adapted. Online traffic skyrocketed. The world was connected again. At least, that's how it seemed at first. In reality, the world had never been more divided. It is in the compartmentalised nature of the internet that the small societal bubbles that had pre-existed the pandemic grew exponentially upon meeting the inflated traffic. These bubbles, when grown so large, undergo a cellular mitosis, splitting into factions, denominations, and subcultures. One such subculture that has prevailed till this day is the red-pilled manosphere. However, there is already plenty of content on the internet rightly criticising the beliefs and actions of those figureheading this campaign. But there isn't nearly enough being said about the mother cell who birthed this radical populist movement. But what bubble is so large that it ejected the titanic wave that is the manosphere movement? Religion? Western societal norms? Perhaps right-wing radical ideologies? While all of these definitely played a part in accelerating the growth of the manosphere, they all still have one thing in common: patriarchy. The majority of the world is run by men, and usually it's institutionalized that way, either overtly through misogynistic laws prohibiting women from positions in power in government or business, or subtly by simply restricting women's access to higher levels of education and deeming their labour less valuable than a man's. These blockades in global corporate and governmental positions repeatedly ingrain into society misogynistic and patriarchal values. This would trickle into mainstream media, and those affected are left with imprints of misogyny. A subtler disdain for women that they might not necessarily map onto the women in their lives, but instead would blanket the world, making assumptions about strangers, maybe based on their race, but that's another issue. Remember, this was all happening before the pandemic, yet still small communities formed on forums such as Reddit, 4chan, Facebook, Instagram, and finally YouTube. In the mid-2010s, there was a huge trend on YouTube. The feminist gets owned, clickbaity title stuff. The debates at hand were fought over topics such as the wage gap, dating culture, and abortion rights. However, there was no actual interest in resolving these issues. Instead, the content was made to simply denigrate and belittle the women who were fighting for equal opportunities, consideration, and rights. The internet simply hated women for no reason. This birthed what I will call the proto-manosphere, the subculture in patriarchy which is now destined on a path to become one of the internet's most devastating phenomena. The important thing about the proto-manosphere is that this was the movement that finally said the quiet part out loud. The systemic misogyny of the 20th century culminated over decades in an explosive trend of anti-feminist content. Now, the movement can grow at the rate of mainstream ideology, amassing large groups of disaffected men and indoctrinated women, all rallying behind the common cause of conserving traditional gendered values and demonising any progressive movements such as Pride and BLM later on. You can see how these populist tactics are still the main driving force of today's manosphere movement. Now we're all caught up, it's time for the split, the mitosis, the ejection of the proto-manosphere. The lockdowns hit. Hatred and vitriol is once again on the rise. The people are looking for anything to blame their problems on. the immigrants, scientists, the deep state, Illuminati. These can all be argued to have a direct link to the spread of the virus. Although not true, immigrants were blamed for spreading the virus between countries, clogging up hospitals, and draining the economy. Scientists were blamed for either creating the virus or not doing enough to stop it, and the global deep state was blamed for making the whole thing up so that everyone can be locked inside whilst they execute their dastardly plans. However, one group with absolutely zero link to the pandemic became hated more than any other. Can you guess? Women. Towards the tail end of the pandemic, influencers such as Andrew Tate, Ben Shapiro, Jordan Peterson, Charlie Kirk, and the like became exceedingly popular, in tandem with rising right-wing groups across Western society. Each influencer spoke from a different angle to a different target demographic. You've got your Ben Shapiros and your Charlie Kirks all talking towards the religious, but you've got your Andrew Tate talking towards your gym bros, and you've got your Jordan Peterson trying to do both at the same time. They're all interlinked with each other, but all very much still divided, until everyone was clued in. And now they share an enormous audience, the manosphere. The term sphere there is doing a lot more work than you actually think. This movement truly does speak to many people, extending equally across all its axes. Still in its relative infancy, the misogynistic content masquerading as male wellness immediately infected mainstream media. But this time, we were used to it. We expected it. We knew what they were going to say. Society has denigrated women on the low for decades and persecuted them for centuries. Is it really a surprise that these ideas would be so quickly accepted by the media? These ideas were being platformed before the pandemic by either religious fundamentalists or those in power wanting to remain in power and maintain as much money as possible. But now these views are being platformed more and more on news channels, podcasts, and YouTube videos. For those like me and you who know this movement as it truly is, deceptive and violent, when we see these people gaining millions of followers, making unfathomable amounts of money, it's easy for us to despair. However, our personal values are safe from their grasp. Their unapologetic attitudes will not sway the minds of anyone who knows their true nature. But the proto-manosphere still exists. The subtler misogyny that you don't see on the internet, but that you see in your day-to-day life. This subtler misogyny, ingrained into society through the long-reaching arm of the patriarchy. This is what poses a threat to our minds and values. We must remain strong and not just tackle the easy target screaming, "Look at me." We must also challenge the very structures that allowed such a disease to fester and spread. Now take time to notice this in real life. Yes, you will see blatant sexism on the internet, but you will see the more innocuous sexism, the dangerous stuff in your day-to-day life. Don't ignore it.